By March 1940, Britain was facing a math problem that could decide whether its people would live or go hungry. German Admiral Karl Dönitz's U-boats were sending 300,000 tons of merchant ships to the bottom of the Atlantic every month. The Royal Navy only had about 200 escort ships to guard thousands of miles of sea routes used by supply convoys. Winston Churchill had just been made First Lord of the Admiralty. That spring, he wrote an urgent note. Britain needed more ships, not later, not next year, but right away. The usual answer was already sitting in the nation's shipyards, the destroyer. These sleek, fast warships showed the best of British engineering. They carried 4.7-inch guns, torpedoes, and were quick enough to chase any submarine seen on the surface. They were powerful and beautiful machines, but they were far too costly. Each destroyer cost about $900,000 back then, equal to roughly $45 million today. They also needed 18 months of skilled labor to build just one. Even if every shipyard worked at full speed, Britain could only produce about 30 each year. While merchant ships were being sunk daily, the Navy needed an entirely new kind of answer. In May 1940, France was collapsing, and the submarine threat kept growing. That was when naval designer William Reed offered an idea that senior officers first laughed at. His ship design wasn't even meant for war. Reed had spent years creating a sturdy whaling ship called the Southern Pride class, simple working vessels that chased whales through freezing Antarctic storms. These ships were built from common materials, regular steel, easy-to-find parts, and methods every coastal shipyard already knew. They weren't fast or comfortable, and no one would call them pretty, but they were cheap, about $90,000 each, and could be built in 8 months. That made a huge difference. For the price of one destroyer, Britain could make 10 of these smaller ships. In the same time it took to build 3 destroyers, they could launch 20 of Reed's new corvettes. The problem changed from building the perfect submarine hunter to building enough ships to fill the ocean so submarines couldn't hide. Commander George Creasy, head of anti-submarine warfare, quickly saw what this meant. The Royal Navy didn't need a few large, perfect ships. It needed numbers, lots of smaller escorts to guard every convoy, forming overlapping protective screens that denied submarines safe attack zones. Destroyers were like precise surgical tools, but the Atlantic called for something blunt and massive. On July 25, 1940, while the Battle of Britain raged in the skies, the Admiralty ordered 58 of these new corvettes, called the Flower class. Each would be named after a flower: Gladiolus, Bluebell, Campanula, an intentional reminder that they were simple, humble ships. The order sparked loud arguments. Traditional naval officers claimed Britain was giving up quality for quantity. These ships could only reach 16 knots, half the speed of a destroyer. They carried one 4-inch gun instead of 4. Their anti-submarine weapons were just depth charges rolled off the back, not fancy launchers that could fire ahead. But none of that mattered when the alternative was no escort at all. By September 1940, monthly shipping losses had risen to 450,000 tons. The first corvette, HMS Gladiolus, finished her testing and sailed to the western approaches to begin escort duty. She didn't look like a warship at all, yet she was about to help save Britain. Admiral Dönitz had been improving his tactics since 1936, when he first took command of Germany's rebuilt submarine fleet. Old-style submarine warfare relied on each boat acting alone, sneak in, strike, then disappear. Dönitz saw that this wasted their best strength, stealth, so he created a new plan known as wolf pack tactics. In a wolf pack, one submarine followed a convoy from a distance and radioed its location. Then several others closed in. When 6 or 8 submarines surrounded the convoy, they attacked together from many directions. The escorts couldn't chase them all at once, and confusion helped the Germans win. The math was terrible for the British. One destroyer could handle one submarine, maybe two, but if 6 attacked from 6 sides, the escort spent all its time racing around while merchant ships burned. On the night of October 18th, 1940, convoy SC-7 learned this lesson the hard way. 43 merchant ships left Sydney, Nova Scotia, protected by just 2 escorts. 5 U-boats found them south of Iceland. By sunrise, 21 ships had been sunk, the worst single convoy disaster of the war. The escorts had no chance. They simply couldn't be everywhere at once. Churchill understood this perfectly. In his first big speech as Prime Minister on March 19, 1940, he used the phrase, "Battle of the Atlantic." He said it was the one campaign that truly scared him. Britain imported 55 million tons of supplies every year, food, oil, ammunition, and raw materials. If those shipments stopped, the army couldn't fight and people would soon starve. To guard those supplies, Britain needed hundreds of escort ships it didn't yet have. The Royal Navy counted 200 escorts in September 1939. Dönitz already had 57 U-boats and was adding 30 more each month. The odds favoured the Germans. The new corvette plan didn't beat the U-boats by being better, it won by being everywhere. Wolfpack tactics depended on the escorts being too few and too slow to respond. But if each convoy had 8, 10, or 12 escorts instead of 2, the math flipped. In September 1941, one U-boat pack tried to attack convoy ON-127. They met HMS Gladiolus, Bluebell, Campanula, Nasturtium, and 4 more corvettes forming a protective circle. Whenever submarines tried to surface and coordinate, corvettes surrounded them, forcing them underwater where they moved slower and couldn't communicate. The wolf pack scattered. This marked a major change in how the Navy thought. For centuries, Britain had focused on building a few powerful ships that could outclass enemy vessels in one-on-one battles. The corvette approach did the opposite, build many good enough ships and win through numbers. It wasn't glamorous. It felt more like factory work than naval pride. Many senior officers hated it. Admiral Dudley Pound even said early corvettes were barely fit for their job. He was right in one way. Each ship alone was weak. But together, they became unstoppable. From October 1940 to March 1941, 30 corvettes joined the fleet. At first, shipping losses still rose. U-boats were sinking ships faster than Britain could replace them. German crews even called this their happy time. But the trend was slowly shifting. Each new corvette narrowed the gap. By May 1941, 89 corvettes were patrolling the Atlantic. Convoys now had 3 times more escorts than before. Submarines still struck, but coordinating attacks was getting harder every month. Dönitz's hunters were discovering that their prey now travelled with its own pack. The corvettes were slower and less elegant, but there were enough of them to change the game. The once helpless merchant ships finally had teeth. Blueprints from Smith's Dock Company, dated August 1940, showed that each corvette was 205 feet long, with a 33-foot beam. The dimensions came almost straight from Reed's Southern Pride whaling ship design. He hadn't drawn a warship at all. He had taken a working commercial hull, removed the whale processing machinery, and added weapons and Navy equipment. The Admiralty purposely kept the design simple. The ships used old-fashioned steam engines instead of modern turbines, riveted seams instead of welded ones, and a single propeller. Every design choice was made so any shipyard in Britain could build them using the tools and workers they already had. This changed everything. Destroyers could only be built in a handful of specialized shipyards equipped with large slips, precision tools, and highly trained engineers. Only 7 yards in all of Britain could handle that work. Corvettes needed none of it. Smith's Dock in Middlesbrough, Hall Russell in Aberdeen, and Harland and Wolff in Belfast all took orders. Even small coastal yards that normally built fishing or freight boats could now help. The Flower-class design used regular 3/8-inch merchant-grade steel plates, standard rivets, and parts already mass-produced for civilian ships. Reed later said he made the plans deliberately simple so that even a yard-building trawlers could switch to corvettes within weeks. The engine choice showed this perfectly. Destroyers used advanced Parsons turbines producing 40,000 horsepower, powerful but complex machines that took 9 months to make. Corvettes used old-style triple-expansion steam engines generating 2,750 horsepower. These engines were based on technology from the 1800s, similar to those in trains and tugboats. Britain already built hundreds of them for commercial ships and factories. When corvette production increased in 1941, engine suppliers even included companies that usually made mining hoists or steam pumps for factories. The engines were heavy, noisy, and shook the ship badly, but they were available right away. Shipbuilding moved quickly because of these choices. At John Crown and Sons in Sunderland, hulls took shape in open-air areas, using the same methods workers had used since Victorian times. Teams of 4 riveters worked together. 1 heated the rivet red hot, 2 pushed it through the holes, and the last one hammered it flat with a pneumatic tool. It was loud, slow, and hard work, but everyone already knew the process. On November 12, 1940, they laid the keel for HMS Campanula. By June 3, 1941, less than 7 months later, she finished testing and joined the fleet at Western Approach's command. Now compare that to the destroyer HMS Jervis, started in August 1937 at Hawthorne Leslie. Her turbines came from 3 different factories. Her electrical and fire control systems had to meet exact naval standards, down to thousandths of an inch. She was completed in May 1939 after 21 months, and required 300,000 hours of expert labour. Jervis was without question the better ship in every way, but she was only one. In those 21 months, British shipyards built 47 corvettes, using the same total labour hours, spread among less skilled workers. Smith's Dock alone launched 42 Flower-class ships, at its fastest producing one every 17 days. The workforce came from ordinary backgrounds, riveters from commercial shipbuilding, welders from scrapyards, and mechanics trained on locomotives. None had special naval certificates. None needed them. The Admiralty had traded perfection for numbers, gambling that more ships, even imperfect ones, could win the war. By December 1941, 151 corvettes were in active service. The gap in Atlantic escorts was closing, not because of advanced technology, but because simple designs allowed mass production. The destroyer HMS Electra, which entered service in February 1939, showed everything the Royal Navy believed about modern sea warfare. Her turbine engines pushed her to 36 knots, fast enough to catch any surfaced submarine and still escape enemy aircraft. She carried 8 4.7-inch guns for surface battles and 5 torpedo launchers that could attack even the biggest enemy ships. Her sonar could find submarines 1,500 yards away, and her Hedgehog mortars could fire explosives forward without losing sonar contact. She cost $922,000 to build and took 18 months of the best workers at the Hawthorne Leslie Yard to complete. Electra was a masterpiece. She could handle almost any combat situation at sea. But on February 27, 1942, Japanese destroyers sank her during the Battle of the Java Sea. In about 7 minutes, Britain lost $922,000 and a year and a half of valuable labour. This was not a rare event. HMS Glowworm, HMS Hardy, and HMS Hostile, all powerful destroyers worth nearly $3 million together, were gone by June 1940. When the war began, Britain had 184 destroyers. By December 1940, 35 of them were sunk or too damaged to use again. Each one lost meant more than a ship. It meant months of work, money, and training that could never be replaced quickly. Corvettes changed that calculation completely. HMS Gladiolus, for example, cost only $90,000, just 1/10 of a destroyer's price. When U-568 sank her on October 16, 1941, Britain lost a ship, yes, but not an irreplaceable one. 7 weeks later, Smith's Dock launched another corvette, HMS Heliotrope, to take her place. The whole process, from loss to replacement, took less time than building a single destroyer. This ability to replace losses fast made a huge difference. The Battle of the Atlantic was a long, grinding fight where ships were constantly destroyed. Britain could afford to lose corvettes and keep replacing them. Destroyers were too expensive and slow to rebuild. From 1940 to 1945, 47 corvettes were lost in battle. Replacing all of them cost about $4.2 million total. Losing 47 destroyers would have cost $43 million and kept British shipyards busy for 3 straight years just to replace them. Time was even more important than money. In September 1940, when Britain was losing 450,000 tons of shipping a month, it needed escort ships immediately, not perfect ships later. For example, the destroyer HMS Opportune started construction in July 1940, but didn't join the fleet until August 1942, 25 months later. During that same time, British shipyards had finished 127 corvettes. Every one of them could escort convoys and hunt submarines, while Opportune was still unfinished. Opportune was far stronger than any corvette, but she wasn't ready when Britain needed her most. This was the problem military planners faced. They could use their materials to make 1 excellent destroyer or 10 good enough corvettes. Which would help more? The Atlantic gave the answer. 10 simple ships were worth far more than 1 perfect one. Convoy defense wasn't about winning single battles. It was about stopping submarines from finding chances to attack at all. A destroyer could rush to a danger zone at 36 knots and fight brilliantly, but 3 other parts of the convoy would remain unguarded. 10 corvettes, even at 16 knots, could spread out and form overlapping protection circles that denied submarines any opening. Admiral Percy Noble, who commanded Western approaches, explained this clearly in December 1941. His fleet needed at least 300 escort vessels to protect Atlantic routes properly. If Britain relied on destroyers, reaching that number would take 8 years. With corvettes, it would take only 18 months. And Britain was already close to that goal. Destroyers were still faster, stronger, and better armed in every way, but that no longer mattered. A perfect ship arriving late was useless. Wars are won by ships that are good enough and available when needed. The corvette was exactly that, good enough, cheap enough, and ready right away. Aboard HMS Gladiolus in November 1940, sailor Ronald Rundle discovered why these ships were nicknamed halfway to hell. The corvette rolled from side to side at terrifying angles, 40 degrees one way, pausing, then 40 degrees the other way, every 8 seconds. And this wasn't a storm. It was a normal Tuesday morning with moderate waves. 2/3 of the crew spent that watch throwing up into buckets or helmets. The rest were too weak to eat. The reason was simple. Corvettes were based on short, wide whaling ship hulls meant to survive heavy seas. That shape kept them from sinking, but made them roll constantly in even mild weather. Destroyers were longer and slimmer, slicing through waves smoothly. Corvettes were shorter and rounder, so they bobbed like corks, twisting and rocking in all directions. Sailors had to time their meals to the ship's motion, take a spoonful at the top of a roll, swallow as it came back down, then brace for the next swing. Life on board was miserable. Gladiolus carried 85 men, though the ship had space for only 47. The mess hall, in the front of the ship where the movement was worst, held 40 sailors in a room just 30 feet by 20 feet. Hammocks were hung so close together that men could barely move without bumping others. When waves reached 15 feet, seawater leaked through vents and doors, soaking everything. Clothes never dried. Mold grew on shoes, bedding, and walls. Lieutenant Commander Henry Chesterman, captain of HMS Campanula, wrote in March 1941 that 60% of his men suffered from saltwater boils, painful sores caused by wet uniforms rubbing against skin for days. The cold was another enemy. Corvettes had no proper heating systems, only small coal stoves in the mess rooms. During submarine alerts, even those stoves had to be turned off because the smoke could reveal their position at night. Men stood watch on open bridges where winter winds froze their faces. Temperatures often dropped below freezing, and frostbite became common. In January 1942, HMS Bluebell's medical officer treated 12 frostbite cases on one Atlantic trip, so routine that they weren't even written in the official log. Speed, or rather the lack of it, caused more problems. A corvette's engines could push it to 16 knots on calm water, but in rough Atlantic waves, that fell to 12 knots. U-boats could move at 17 knots on the surface, which meant corvettes could never chase them. Their only tactic was to force the submarines to dive and then attack with depth charges. Commander Donald McIntyre, who led the escort group for convoy HX-112 in March 1941, watched helplessly as U-boats followed his convoy from just out of range. They reported its position to others while staying safely ahead. When he sent one destroyer, HMS Vanuk, to chase them, the submarines scattered. His corvettes could only plod along slowly, soaked and freezing, unable to pursue. Even so, these rough, slow ships did their jobs. In 1941, corvettes spent more days at sea than any other type of British ship, about 240 days a year, compared to 180 for destroyers. They couldn't outrun submarines, so they stayed at sea longer, making sure the convoys were never left alone. The crews learned to survive constant seasickness, to sleep in wet clothes, to stay alert while half frozen. They didn't have comfort or speed, but they had endurance. The Flower-class corvettes were miserable to live on, poorly equipped for battle, and crewed by men who deserved better. Yet those men saved their country. On March 16, 1941, HMS Gladiolus scored her first kill. She found the German submarine U-47, commanded by the famous Günther Prien, the same man who had snuck into Scapa Flow in 1939 and sunk HMS Royal Oak. Gladiolus detected U-47 using sonar at 1,400 yards, moved in through rough seas, and dropped 14 depth charges in a diamond pattern. U-47's hull collapsed 180 feet below the surface, killing Prien and his 45 crew. One of Germany's most celebrated captains was gone. Britain had lost nothing but a few depth charges worth $35 each. It was a cheap victory with massive importance, and these victories began to pile up. HMS Bluebell destroyed U-651 in June 1941. HMS Campanula sank U-74 in May. HMS Narcissus took down U-568 in October. By December 1941, corvettes had sunk 19 confirmed U-boats, more than all British destroyers combined during the same period. This didn't happen because corvettes were more powerful. It happened because they were everywhere. Destroyers spent 60% of their time docked for maintenance, refueling, or giving the crew rest. Their complex machinery needed constant care. Corvettes, with their simpler engines, stayed at sea 70% of the time. More days on patrol meant more chances to meet the enemy and more U-boats destroyed. A clear pattern emerged. When submarines saw corvettes on the surface, they would dive immediately, not because corvettes were dangerous individually, but because there were so many of them. Once underwater, U-boats lost their 17-knot surface speed and could move only about 7 knots. Now corvettes, even at 16 knots, were faster. They circled the area using sonar, keeping the submarines trapped below until their batteries drained. Eventually, the U-boats either surfaced into gunfire or stayed down until depth charges finished them. Commander Peter Gretton, who led a corvette escort group called B-7, described this method simply. "We couldn't outrun them, so we outlasted them. But even brave endurance had limits." On October 16, 1941, HMS Gladiolus was torpedoed by U-5, 68 south of Iceland. She sank in 4 minutes, taking 80 of her 85 crew with her. This showed the weakness of the corvettes. Their thin commercial steel couldn't survive torpedo hits. Between 1940 and 1945, 47 Flower-class corvettes were destroyed. 22 were sunk by submarines, 11 by aircraft, 7 by mines, 4 in surface battles, and 3 by collision. Each loss killed an average of 65 men. The price in lives was terrible, but Britain kept replacing them faster than they were lost. By mid-1942, there were already over 200 corvettes in service, even after those losses. When the war ended, the Admiralty released its final report in 1946. Flower-class corvettes had been part of battles that destroyed 294 U-boats between 1940 and 1945. 47 were sunk by corvettes acting alone, and another 247 were shared kills with other ships. No other Allied warship class came close. Destroyers destroyed 174 U-boats in total. Frigates sank 187. Aircraft had the highest number at 386, but corvettes came second, despite being the smallest and simplest ships of all. Commander Donald McIntyre, who personally sank 5 U-boats while leading corvette groups, later wrote that their success came from being everywhere the submarines didn't expect. They were cheap enough to cover the entire ocean. The exchange rate was stunning. Britain lost 47 corvettes worth $4.2 million total, but those ships helped destroy U-boats worth about $73 million combined. Each German Type 7 submarine cost around $250,000 to build, and with each one lost, Germany also lost 45 trained crewmen, experts who needed 9 months of training. Dönitz's U-boat force never fully recovered from those losses. The small, uncomfortable corvettes, built for fishing and whaling, not for war, had crushed Germany's submarine fleet, not with superior weapons, but with sheer numbers and relentless presence. They proved that sometimes quantity can win where quality fails. German U-boat design showed some of the best engineering in the world. The main submarine, the Type 7C, was Dönitz's workhorse. It used a diesel-electric system that let it move at 17 knots on the surface and stay underwater for 7 hours. Its strong pressure hulls could go as deep as 280 meters. It fired new kinds of torpedoes that followed the sound of ship propellers, and its Enigma machines let submarines talk to each other secretly across thousands of miles. Each Type 7C took 16 months to build and needed parts from 27 different factories in Germany. These submarines were amazing pieces of technology. But even at the height of production in 1942, Germany could only build 25 each month. Britain answered in a totally different way. Instead of focusing on a few perfect machines, it built hundreds of simple ones. Today, this would be called platform proliferation, using large numbers of basic units to overpower complex ones. From July 1940 to May 1945, British and Canadian shipyards completed 267 Flower-class corvettes, plus 151 improved Castle-class ships. Together, that made 418 sub-hunting vessels against Germany's 1,153 U-boats. At first, that ratio looked bad for Britain, but when you counted which ships were actually at sea, it changed completely. German U-boats spent 60% of their time in port for refueling, repairs, and training. Only 40% of them were at sea at any given time. Corvettes, by contrast, were at sea 70% of the time. That meant there were roughly 290 corvettes patrolling the Atlantic at once against about 460 U-boats, and the corvettes worked in teams. U-boats, as Allied defences improved, were forced to operate alone. The balance began to shift. Production speed tilted it even further. When HMS Campanula was sunk in June 1942, Smith's Dock began building her replacement just 3 weeks later. The new Campanula was launched and in service by November, only 5 months from start to finish. When Germany lost U-135 that same July, construction on its replacement, U-1065, began right away. But it didn't enter service until September 1944, over 2 years later. British shipbuilding now worked more like a factory making cars. Parts were standardized and interchangeable. Many shipyards could work on several corvettes at once. Germany's submarines, however, were still built like handmade machines. Each one was different, assembled by specialists in careful steps that couldn't happen at the same time. This difference even showed in repairs. Corvettes used simple commercial engines built to last in regular ships, not fine-tuned for military precision. When HMS Bluebell's engine broke a connecting rod in February 1942, mechanics in Londonderry replaced it with one taken from an old merchant ship. The repair took just 4 days. If a destroyer's turbine engine was damaged, it had to be sent back to a special shipyard and repaired for at least 6 weeks. This simplicity made corvettes far more available for combat. The Admiralty calculated in 1943 that corvettes averaged only 22 days between port visits, compared to 14 for destroyers, even though corvettes faced worse weather and longer missions. Germany never adjusted to this mass production approach. Dönitz kept asking for small, fast coastal submarines, something simple, quick to build, like Britain's corvettes. But Grand Admiral Raeder refused. He insisted on keeping high-quality standards. The new Type 21 submarines introduced in 1944 proved this thinking. They were revolutionary, able to move faster underwater than on the surface and stay submerged almost indefinitely using snorkel air systems. They were technological wonders, but they took 24 months to build. Germany completed 118 before the war ended, and none were ready in time to matter. They were magnificent machines that came too late to change anything. Britain had chosen the opposite path. Use what you can make now, then improve it step by step. The first Flower-class corvettes were miserable to serve on, cold, cramped, and constantly rolling, but the next designs got better. The modified Flower-class of 1942 added improved heating, stronger anti-aircraft guns, and better living quarters. Then came the Castle class in 1943. These had smoother hulls that reduced rolling, more powerful engines that reached 20 knots, and new squid mortars that could launch depth charges forward while keeping sonar contact. Each new version learned from the last, while staying simple enough to mass produce. By 1944, corvettes had become very effective submarine hunters, and Britain had nearly 300 of them in service. German engineering remained top-notch. German strategy did not. Having the best design meant nothing if you couldn't build enough of them. Quality without quantity became just expensive failure. When the war ended, Britain added up the final cost of its corvette program. In August 1946, the Treasury received the numbers: 267 Flower-class ships at $90,000 each, plus 151 Castle-class ships averaging $140,000. The total was $45.2 million, about $2.2 billion in today's value. That was only 2.8% of all Britain's wartime naval spending. For that small portion of the budget, the Royal Navy had built the fleet that kept the Atlantic lifeline open long enough for American help to arrive and turn the tide. Now imagine if Britain had chosen destroyers instead. Each convoy needed at least 8 escorts for safety. Between 1940 and 1945, about 300 convoys sailed each year across the Atlantic. To protect them all at once, allowing time for repairs and losses, Britain would have needed around 3,000 destroyers in total during the war. At $900,000 each, that would have cost $2.7 billion, 60 times more than the Corvette program. That difference, about $2.65 billion, funded other major operations instead. For example, Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion of Normandy, cost around $850 million. It paid for landing craft, special tanks, ammunition, and all the supplies to invade Europe. The campaigns in North Africa and Italy, from Operation Torch onward, cost another $640 million. The strategic bombing campaign, including Lancaster bombers and the airfields to launch them, used another $520 million. Together, those three efforts, the ones that actually defeated Germany, cost $2.01 billion. The money saved by choosing corvettes instead of destroyers almost covered all three. By picking simple, affordable ships, Britain kept enough industrial capacity to fight in several theatres at once instead of spending everything on protecting one sea route. The results could be seen clearly in the numbers. In November 1942, merchant losses in the Atlantic peaked at 768,000 tons per month. That was the moment Dönitz came closest to cutting off Britain's supplies completely. But by May 1943, those losses had dropped to 264,000 tons, while U-boat sinkings rose to 41 in a single month. On May 24, 1943, Dönitz pulled his wolf packs out of the North Atlantic. He admitted that the losses were too heavy to continue. The war at sea wasn't over, but the crisis was. Britain would no longer starve. Convoys were finally getting through safely. Corvettes had made that possible, not by being perfect, but by always being there. On June 1st, 1943, Western Approaches Command counted 187 corvettes in service compared to 94 destroyers. Those corvettes provided the strength in numbers that transformed convoy defense from desperate reaction to organized protection. After mid-1941, no convoy sailed unguarded. By 1943, most had 8 or more escorts. U-boats now faced walls of sonar pings, overlapping depth charge attacks, and tightly coordinated escort groups. Dönitz's wolfpack strategy, which relied on thin defenses, no longer worked. The ocean was simply too full of enemy ships. The real difference wasn't just the cost per ship. $90,000 versus $900,000, it was $45 million buying victory versus $2.7 billion buying bankruptcy. Britain entered World War II as the world's biggest lender nation. It ended as the world's biggest debtor, owing $3.4 billion, mostly to the United States and Canada. If the destroyer plan had been used instead of corvettes, that debt would have been far worse, so bad that Britain might have been forced into a peace deal in 1943 just to avoid financial collapse. The corvette program, once mocked for being cheap and ugly, ended up buying something priceless: time and survival. It kept Britain in the war until final victory. The humble Flower-class ships, built from commercial steel and powered by outdated engines, saved not just convoys, but the nation itself. They proved that sometimes the simplest tools made by ordinary people can change the course of history. By the end of the war, the numbers told the full story. Britain's corvettes had spent 5 long years battling through freezing winds and giant waves. Their crews lived in cramped, damp spaces with little rest or comfort. Still, they stayed at sea longer than any other sailors, guarding the supply routes that kept their nation alive. The Flower-class corvettes began as simple whaling ships turned into war machines. They were slow and rough to live on, yet cheap and quick to build. They filled the Atlantic in ways no destroyer fleet could. They didn't just hunt submarines, they became a steel wall that German U-boats couldn't break through. Individually small, together they transformed the Atlantic from a hunting ground into a protected highway for Allied ships. German U-boats started the war as deadly predators, sinking ship after ship with ease, but over time, their advantage disappeared. Each new convoy sailed with more escorts. Each month brought better sonar, smarter tactics, and quicker responses. The once empty ocean now swarmed with corvettes. The wolf packs found fewer chances to strike. When one submarine tried to hide, another corvette found it. When a U-boat surfaced to breathe or recharge, it was already being watched. By 1944, Dönitz's submarines were sinking faster than Germany could replace them. His best captains were dead, new crews were untrained, and new submarines took too long to build. The balance of power at sea had completely changed. Corvettes made that difference not through speed or strength, but by always being there. They filled every gap and denied the U-boats the open water they needed. Even their design showed clever thinking. Their short, wide hulls made them roll badly in calm seas, but helped them survive violent storms. Their old engines shook the ships so much that bulbs shattered, yet those same engines could be repaired anywhere. They ran on simple fuel, used standard steel, and could be built by local workers instead of expert engineers. Britain's shipyards became giant assembly lines. Workers who once built fishing boats now launched warships every few weeks. Factories that made train engines turned to making ship engines. The whole country joined one vast effort. The corvette became more than a ship, it became a symbol of British endurance. In total war, success came not from perfection, but from production. Destroyers like HMS Electra showed craftsmanship and strength, but the Flower-class corvettes showed something deeper: determination, unity, and courage against all odds. When the war ended, leaders agreed that without those small ships, Britain would never have survived long enough for America to join the fight. The numbers proved it. From 1940 to 1945, corvettes helped sink 294 German U-boats and escorted tens of thousands of merchant ships carrying food, fuel, and troops. They fought in ice, fog, air attacks, and raging seas, where men tied themselves to railings just to stand. Their cost was high. 47 corvettes were lost and over 3,000 sailors died. But their sacrifice kept the lifeline open. Every tank on D-Day, every bomber in the sky, every soldier who reached Europe owed its journey to the corvettes. These men rarely received fame or glory. They were soaked, frozen, and exhausted for months. Their ships smelled of oil and salt. Their hammocks hung inches apart, and the engine noise never stopped. Yet they kept going because they knew Britain's survival depended on them. The Corvette program was also a financial victory. It cost $45 million in total, tiny compared to the billions spent elsewhere. That small investment bought survival. If Britain had built destroyers instead, the nation might have gone bankrupt before 1943. By 1945, Britain already owed $3.4 billion to the United States and Canada. A destroyer-based escort plan would have doubled that debt and possibly forced an early peace before victory. Instead, the Corvette program kept Britain fighting beside its allies to the end. After the war, many surviving Flower-class ships found new lives. Some became merchant or fishing vessels, others were scrapped to rebuild cities, and a few turned into museums or training ships. But for the men who served on them, they were unforgettable. They remembered decks tilting so sharply that sky and sea swapped places, rivets creaking under pressure, and the smell of smoke and salt water. They remembered nights when the horizon glowed with burning ships, and mornings when nothing existed but grey waves. Most of all, they remembered saving lives, pulling freezing sailors from the sea, watching convoys reach port safely, and knowing their work had mattered. Those memories meant more than medals. The Flower-class corvettes proved that a nation doesn't need perfection to win. It needs courage, creativity, and the will to adapt. When engineers first designed them, they were solving one problem: how to build enough ships to keep Britain alive. That simple goal ended up saving a country. By 1943, the U-boats had lost the Battle of the Atlantic. Dönitz pulled them back, not because they were weak, but because the sea was too full of enemies. Everywhere a U-boat went, a corvette was waiting. Those little ships kept supply lines open, giving the Allies the strength to invade Europe, free France, and defeat Germany. Without them, the war might have ended very differently. Their story is about ordinary people and simple machines achieving the impossible. The builders who worked in cold shipyards, the sailors who braved endless storms, and the officers who refused to give up, all played their part. When people think of great warships, they picture carriers, battleships, and destroyers. But the small, stubborn corvettes did what none of them could. They guarded the ocean day and night, keeping open the path that allowed freedom to survive. Each one cost less than a modern sports car today, but together they saved millions of lives. They taught a lesson that still matters. Real strength comes from persistence. The destroyers were fast and strong, but few. The corvettes were small and weak, but everywhere, and that was enough. In war, victory doesn't always come from brilliance, it comes from endurance. Britain's humble corvettes, built in small shipyards by everyday workers, proved that truth. They carried a nation's hope across grey, stormy seas, and they delivered. The Battle of the Atlantic was won not by the biggest guns or fastest ships, but by a fleet of modest vessels that refused to stop sailing. History will always remember the Flower-class corvettes, not as perfect ships, but as the right ships, built at the right time by the right people. They were the ships that saved Britain.